Hello, true believers, and welcome to Comics Inc., your comic book podcast here on BigRedBarel.com. I'm joined, finally, after a long absence, by Rick.
Hello! I forgot how to say hello then.
You forgot the cue for your own name, which is hearing me say your name.
I wasn't paying attention.
I honestly thought he was just going to blank you that whole time as well.
I was a little worried that was how it was going to go. We've had a very exciting pre-show, getting audio synced up.
Actually, I've changed my name to Rictavius, and you're not respecting that, so...
Sorry, let me try again. Sorry, I can't give a straight face with that. Rictavius.
Yeah, Rictavius.
Can we just shorten it to Rick for the sake of ease?
You know what? Yeah, let's do that.
Cool. Well, so we're joined by Rick, and the other voice that you heard chastising good Rictavius there is Ryan.
Hello.
We finally made it, all three of us, back together in time for a special episode, slightly sad one. Rick pointed out before we started recording that every time the three of us are together, it's because someone notable has died, although this one happened a little while ago, so hopefully it's not as a direct result of our plan for this podcast.
I've got to say, considering that this is a really sad topic, you sound well jovial.
Well, I'm trying to keep it light. I'm trying to, celebrate life, not get all maudlin about it. But we are, if you didn't guess from the thumbnail and probably the episode title as well, talking about the late great Stan Lee, who sadly died a few weeks ago. Now that we've come together to talk about kind of everything that he did, as I say, a celebration of the life, not the fact that he died, which is just sad on its own. But yeah, Stan Lee, for those not familiar, we were quite surprised if we were listening to a comic book podcast and not familiar with who Stan Lee was. But he was sort of the godfather of comic books as a medium, if you like. He was born Stanley Lieberman. Stan Lee was a name he adopted later on, kind of a pen name that was also the name that he just had. I don't really know why, but he used to work for a company way back in the 1950s called Timely Comics, the entity that you now know as Marvel Comics. And Stan was an editor there for quite a long time until in 1961 he changed what we think of as comic books as a medium and invented kind of the modern superhero with the Fantastic Four. He also co-created with Jack Kirby as well, who was obviously a very famous artist from that era. And from then on, he kind of was just on a roll. He invented just about every Marvel Comics character you've heard of. There's well over 100 that he was involved in. Heroes, villains, kind of supporting characters, but some other less famous characters like the X-Men and someone called Spider-Man. I've not heard. Do you guys know Spider-Man?
It sounds familiar.
Yeah, it sounds familiar, but it sounds like a really generic...
Isn't he that Japanese guy that's got a massive robot?
Oh, yeah, that's the one, yeah.
Yeah, I know
obviously,
him. I know him.
Not as famous as everyone's favourite superhero, the Stilt Man. All joking aside, Spider-Man is probably Stan Lee's most famous creation. On balance now, maybe some of the Avengers like Iron Man and Thor. Well, obviously, Stan Lee didn't invent the concept of Thor. That was, I presume, some sort of Scandinavian poet about 2,000 years ago. But
no, Stan Lee was just that old.
you joke, but that is kind of an interesting thing. I think for everyone, the three of us are roughly in the same age bracket. There's a few years between us, but I think it's interesting to note that Stan Lee was, I believe he was 39 when he created the Fantastic Four in 1961. So he's kind of been a fixture of pop culture and not just comics, in fact, because that was the most successful thing. People say that the thing that Stan Lee was the best at selling was Stan Lee. And after all those years, he kind of managed to become sort of an omnipresent fixture. So we wrote down a few thoughts about when we kind of first became aware of Stan. So for me, it was the PlayStation 1 Spider-Man game. It was just called Spider-Man. And he was the narrator of it, so he did all the menus, he did the kind of interstitial stuff. And I remember being a kid and I just thought he had a cool voice. He had that very, I'm not going to do a terrible impression of him because it would seem in bad taste now, but quite a familiar voice. And I remember thinking that he just sounded cool, and then I asked my dad about it, and he said that was, the person who created Spider-Man, and I remember being slightly confused at the concept of someone had made up Spider-Man. Firstly, that he wasn't real, and secondly, that he'd ever just sort of not existed.
How old are you?
I'm 25.
Wow. You would have been really young when that came out.
Yeah, it was probably one of the first games I remember playing. When did that game come out?
I don't even remember a Spider-Man game for the PS1.
What, really?
What am I thinking of? I don't know.
How old are you?
Oh, I'm 26, but my PlayStation 1 games were FIFA and...
Barbie's Special Horse Magic.
So the Spider-Man game, it came out in 2000, and then it had a sequel called Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro, which had a famously controversial end scene involving the Twin Towers when it came out, and then they had to edit it and change it to a different building in New York, because by the time it was developed to the time it came out, those buildings weren't there anymore.
And it's also the reason that I smashed my PlayStation.
Oh yeah? Just out of frustration, or?
I had a temper and I could not do that game. And I lost my temper and I punched my PlayStation and dislodged the laser.
I mean, that'll do it. Yeah, it was an okay game, but I remember it being a bit janky and frustrating. The best thing about it, I remember, was that you could change Spider-Man's costume, a bit like the new one. It had like a selection of costumes from like different comic books and stuff, and Stan Lee would talk about them and had little bits and jokes about what the different ones looked like. But yeah, that was kind of how I first became aware of him in a PlayStation destroying game from the year 2000. But what about you guys?
Well, for me, he's always just kind of been there. Like, I don't remember a time in my life when Stan Lee wasn't present, in the same way that Bill Murray's always been there. And certain actors and musicians have always been there. Stan Lee's just always been a name. I have been a Spider-Man fan for a very long time, and I used to watch the cartoon. And then he had cameos in that and did things with that. So the name's always been present. And then I think the first time that I took notice of him as a person, like Stan Lee as an entity, when he wasn't just a disembodied voice in a TV series or in a game or something like that, was when I was about 17 and I was watching Mallrats, and he has that amazing bit in Mallrats where it's more than just a cameo. You have seen Mallrats, right, guys? Come on.
No, I don't think I don't know.
I haven't, but I think I've heard about that scene.
Kevin Smith's second movie.
I mean, I'm not old enough to remember Kevin Smith's first movie.
I am revoking your nerd cards.
Well, you've heard Rick, I've been fired. Goodbye, everyone. We got everyone back together, and now I'm leaving forever.
So if anyone would like a job, it doesn't pay. You got to put up with me. But the only prerequisite, you need to at least have seen Kevin Smith's first 2 movies.
Just on mentioning the Kevin Smith connection, though, there is a really good episode of the Fat Man on Batman podcast, because Kevin Smith is someone who had quite a personal connection to Stan before he got into the movie industry, and then, like you say, worked with him on Mallrats and a bunch of other things. There's a really nice kind of eulogy that he gives about what he was like as a person, which is obviously more specific than most could kind of get to. But that's really interesting if you want to learn a little bit more about. So yeah, he was good in the Mallrats movie?
Yes.
What is his role in that, as someone who's not seen it?
Stan Lee.
Oh, he plays himself. Oh, okay.
Yeah, he's doing a signing at a comic book store, and Brody's trying to meet him, but he ends up meeting him in the mall and just has a quick chat with him, and he gives him some sagely Stan Lee advice.
I see.
And then talks about the Thing's penis.
I mean, sure.
It's a very good cameo.
I mean, Stan Lee was the king of the cameo. I think that's a pretty
He
undisputed fact at this point. We can talk a bit more about that. But Ryan, when was your first memory of Stan Lee, or at least the first time you became aware of him as an entity?
I think it's similar to Rick in terms of like I've always known of him, and he's been very strong in a pop culture perspective. But I think mainly the Marvel cameos probably cemented who he was. I mean, I've heard a lot of stories and reading so much online over the past few weeks and months anyway, just because Stan Lee he was effectively everywhere. No matter when he did a cameo or whatever, people would write about him, and you hear so many different stories, and you think, oh, actually, no, I do remember him from cameo X, 15 years ago, before the Marvel movies. So I think he's definitely been someone that, from a pop culture point of view, he's always been around. He's done cameos in things like The Big Bang Theory and things like that, where you just, you spot people in different things. But obviously, everyone knows him mainly because of the Marvel cameos more recently, anyway, and how important it was. Where you'd go into a Marvel movie, and some people would go in just wanting to see the Stan Lee cameo, or that would be what they're not thinking about the plot of the movie. They're just thinking, right, where's Stan Lee? Where is he? Where is he? I
mean, those cameos were pretty good. I'm struggling to remember one that was actively terrible or really distracted from any of the films. I think at least they managed to make them interesting.
I think the only one that couldn't really do enough justice with it was, Deadpool only had him as like a painted figure on a building. He wasn't actually in the film.
No, he's in
Deadpool had him in the strip club.
Sorry, Deadpool 2.
Deadpool 2, yeah, had him as a painting.
Yeah.
But Deadpool had him
Deadpool
as
2.
a strip club DJ. That was one of his best ones.
That is true. That was a good one.
I mean, my favourite one's probably, is it Iron Man or Iron Man 2? Iron Man, where he calls him Hugh Hefner.
Oh, yes, yeah.
That's the best one.
I'm also my favourite one, I think, is the one in Thor Ragnarok. Just the one where he gives Thor a haircut with his, like, weird blender hand.
Yeah.
Just because I enjoyed the fact that they managed to get, like, at that point, 92-year-old Stan Lee to wear that ridiculous, like, polystyrene Jack Kirby Fourth World costume. I thought that was hilarious.
I liked it in Guardians 2, where he's with the Watchers and he's just telling the stories of all of his cameos.
Oh, yeah.
So it kind of cements that fan theory that he has been playing the same person in all of the films.
Yeah, he's just wandering around and getting into superhero-adjacent mishaps.
Yeah, I thought that was a really nice little touch to sort of bring everything together. And this is something that I think Phase 4 is really going to miss. Like, it's going to feel very different to not have Stanley cameos in it. I mean, Spider-Man Far From Home is going to have one. Because he already filmed that.
Yeah.
But then after that, nothing.
Is that the last one?
Yeah, because it's the last film that was in production while he was alive.
I suppose so.
I mean, you'll probably see, because in Daredevil and things like that, they have him as a photograph in the police department.
That's true.
So you'll probably have things like that, and like Ryan said with the Deadpool 2 one where it's a painting on a wall.
Yeah, that's true.
But as for actual spoken lines of dialogue, it's going to be weird.
It's an interesting thing if there's just going to be an end to it. Because you're right, like, as you both said, the fact that he's always just kind of existed. He's just been in the world, like, attached to the characters and just as his own entity for longer than most people, period, but, like, longer than most people who are really big fans of this stuff from childhood. And so the fact that his ubiquitous presence is just gone now is kind of a strange thing. I mean, that's the really weird thing about Stan Lee as an entity, is that because he started, the superhero trend that he started when he was in his 40s, but he lived through to his 90s, it just kind of seemed inevitable he was going to hang around forever.
Yeah.
Now, we're getting maudlin again. I mean, it's difficult not to, I suppose, because he's such a big part of everyone's childhood. Like, these characters are, like Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four and the X-Men and the Hulk and all the rest of the Avengers now, especially for people about a generation younger than us, are just kind of omnipresent and really ingrained in popular culture. But I suppose we can take something from the fact that those characters are never going to go anywhere. Like, for as long as there are storytelling mediums and, if we're being honest, money for the Disney Corporation to make, there's going to be a Spider-Man somewhere. There'll be toys and games and movies.
Well, that's the thing. I don't think it's got anything to do with the fact that he was just a big presence because we were children and he created these characters. I think it's more that he genuinely changed the face of pop culture. Like, look at Hollywood at the moment. Hollywood would not be doing what it's doing now if it wasn't for his characters or characters that he helped co-create and cultivate.
That is true.
The games industry, the general entertainment industry, there was such a big influence from the stuff that he and his team and even the Distinguished Competition were doing that was all driven by him. Like, you touched upon the fact that he changed the face of comics in 1961 with Fantastic Four. The reason he did that is because he put the human in superhuman. He made these characters relatable. He gave them problems. He was like, Superman's invulnerable, nothing but a rock can hurt him. What a boring character. I'm going to give my characters actual problems. A favourite plot point that he liked to repeat with his characters was the fact that they couldn't afford rent that month. They all had relationships that weren't great. There was a lot of infighting among friends and families because people had different opinions. The whole thing with the Fantastic Four not wearing masks and using their real names is because he was like, well, if I was a superhero, I wouldn't want to wear a mask. I want everyone to know who I am. The reason that everything's in New York is because he lived in New York. He could relate to New York. There was an element of realism in those comics, no matter how fantastical they were, because they were in real places. They were going to the hot dog place that you go to. They were going to see films in the cinema that you went to. They'd go to Madison Square Garden. All this stuff was happening. Like, they lived in buildings and areas that you knew. Like, Stan was from the Bronx. He'd write characters from there and all the areas surrounding it and everything, and he made them very real. And it was that level of, I suppose, realism and accessibility to characters that made more people relate to the human side of those characters. No one can relate to being Spider-Man, but I know for a fact that each and every one of us can relate to being Peter Parker.
That is very true. I suppose that's the thing he doesn't necessarily get enough credit for, is the fact that the Marvel Universe's primary location is New York City, which is a real place, as opposed to, as you say, DC has Gotham and Metropolis, and I don't know any of the
Central
other ones.
City.
Yeah, but those aren't real. Those aren't real places. They're drawn out, extrapolated versions, and in some ways that plays into DC's whole mythic universe thing that they like to build. And like Gotham City is at once it's Chicago, New York, Victorian London, and wherever else it needs to be from moment to moment. But New York is a place that we could all go to if we want to. If we didn't live there already, it's one of the most popular places in the whole world. Populated places, I should say. And we could all go there. We could look at the buildings that Spider-Man swings through and the Fantastic Four lived in. I mean, it's probably only a matter of time before they build that Avengers Tower from the movies. Before they just clear out an area of square, like ground somewhere, and just stick up a building with a giant A on it. And then we really will be living in the best world.
Unless you're Ryan, who's a DC fanboy.
I mean, there is that. But...
yeah, well, I'd still appreciate it. Let's be honest.
You'd look at it and be like, "It's no Wayne Tower."
That's what I need in my life. I need a Wayne Tower built.
I mean, both of those things would be good. To be fair, I think it's the kind of things that he made. Like you say, he made the human in superhuman. There's a fact that no one thought to do that before, because he didn't invent characters like Captain America, for example.
Well, no, when he came onto Timely Comics, they were already writing Captain America. He was just there as a personal assistant and coffee boy who would have to write a toothpaste spread occasionally.
But yeah, those characters, I think he didn't get enough credit for making. Oh no, that's not true. He got a fantastic amount of credit, and some people would argue too much credit. But those things are less talked about than just the fact that he came up with the idea for what if there was a guy but he crawled on walls a bit, or what if there was a family but they had superpowers and really bad names. Like, in terms of his presence in pop culture, it's tying into the cameos thing that we were talking about a moment ago. It is, as of last year, at least according to the website thenumbers.com, which deals in kind of Hollywood box office statistics, Stan Lee was the highest grossing actor, or at least the highest grossing American actor, because he was in every single Marvel-related film that had ever existed, not just the MCU, but he was in Venom that came out this year, that was a Sony production, but he was also in the original Spider-Man trilogy, the ones that Sam Raimi made. He was in the Daredevil with Ben Affleck movie, the original Hulk. Do you guys remember that he's in the Hulk movie that Ang Lee directed?
Yes.
Because I had completely forgotten about that movie, period, to be honest. But
You're
actually,
a very lucky human being.
It is not good, but it does.
I'm not saying that film's garbage, but it isn't great.
No, it's no one's best effort, let's say that.
No. Although Nick Nolte was giving it his all.
That's true. I mean, you might as well, I suppose, if that's the job you've been given, to turn into, like, weird absorbing man. But yeah, he was the most, the highest grossing, the widest spread actor. He was in a colossal amount of movies, considering, like, that he wasn't an actor or a movie person.
He always wanted to be, though. He never wanted to get into books. He always wanted to be an actor. He grew up in the Depression, so he always had this idea of, like, the importance of money instilled in him because his parents didn't have any. Like, they lived in a one-bedroom apartment. They slept on the sofa bed so he could have a bedroom. So he'd been working since he was about 14. But he really wanted to be an actor because Errol Flynn was, like, his favourite hero. And it was that he bought into the books when he started working for Timely. And now, well, say now, but since he took that side of Marvel to California, when he took them out of New York to California to set up the Marvel Productions, so they could do, what was the Spider-Man cartoon, like Spider-Man and Friends or something? It had Iceman in it.
Which one? The one from the
From the 60s.
Oh, from the 60s,
From the
yeah.
60s.
I think it was something like Spider-Man and Friends. Let's see, I think that's right.
It had Iceman and someone else in it. But he moved to California, moved to Hollywood to do that stuff, and then he started getting into movies and he started acting a little bit with the cameos and stuff that he was doing, and he started writing and helping out, and it was through comics that he actually became a part of Hollywood and started to do the thing that he genuinely wanted to do. That's why he'd always loved what he did for Marvel, because it gave him the life that he'd always wanted. He'd famously said that he never wanted to retire because he's having too much fun doing what he's doing, and if he retired, he'd have to stop doing it. So why punish him by making him retire?
Exactly. Just the TV show that you were thinking of is Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends.
There we go. 'Cause Super Friends is DC, isn't it?
Yeah, Super Friends is the other one, but Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, which is not great as titles go, but some of the art that you can find.
Spider-Man and his positive adjective friends.
I mean, I suppose it's because it was The Amazing Spider-Man, probably at the time, was the comic book. Unless it was still spectacular at that point. But again, it's still the fact that there's cartoons dating all the way back to the 60s, which in fact, at least according to this Wikipedia article that I hastily opened, Stan Lee was involved in. He narrated the TV series.
That's where he first started doing cameos, I suppose, for his characters.
And I mean, it's strange, like the amount of stuff that he's in. And it's interesting that you say that he never wanted to be in comic books. I can completely understand that, because especially prior to what Stan Lee came in and did with them, they weren't that prestigious a medium, really. They were printed on rubbish paper and designed to be looked at once and then thrown in the bin or recycled, or in some cases used as wall insulation.
It was pulp. It was pulp fiction, literally.
Yeah, and the fact that he managed to change, more or less by dint of his own effort, really, into something that was movie-worthy, was cinematic, and was kind of as world-spanning as it eventually became, is kind of testament to how well that stuff started.
But that took such a long time. When he was 16, World War II was kicking off big time. That's why Captain America was there. So they were just doing propaganda.
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
He actually joined the army while he was at Timely, and he ended up becoming a playwright for the army to help with the propaganda machine. And it wasn't until, I think, 3 years he was in the army for. I think he came out when he was 23. That's when he came back, but Timely was now Marvel. But then by this point, the Comic Codes Authority was kicking in with their, you're not allowed to have anything naughty in comic books. And then for 10 years, he was creating stuff in these really confined and just awful sort of like constrictions with what he was and wasn't allowed to do with comics. That's why he created the Fantastic Four, because he was ready to leave. He was going to quit comics. And Joan turned around to him and said, well, why don't you just write one more story, but do it your way. Do what you want to do. Because what's the worst that's going to happen? They can fire you, but you want to leave anyway, so you might as well risk it.
I mean, it's like just testament to the amount of like the luck, I suppose. Not luck in the sense of just blind luck and not putting any effort into it, but yeah, like you say, he happened to write that one extra story because he decided it was worth just trying it or getting sacked anyway. And if he hadn't bothered, what would we have instead of comic books now? I mean, they probably still exist because they existed before Stan Lee, but we wouldn't have superheroes, we wouldn't have any of the stuff that's come after it, all the things that have been informed by it across every kind of popular media, probably. We'd probably be like the universe from Watchmen, and we'd all be reading like comic books about pirates.
I mean, that doesn't sound too bad.
I mean,
Pirates
that's pretty good,
great.
but it's pirates are fun, but they're no Spider-Man. Or Stiltman, the other character that I just remembered existed.
Stiltman.
Yeah, there's
the
a
real hero of every story.
I mean, there was a point where Stan Lee was writing like a colossal amount of comic books. Like Rick said, there was he had a recurring story about his characters not being able to pay rent, and there's definitely a point where he just started pulling names out of the ether and just going, yeah, that'll be fine. It's a something man, that'll do. So it gives you characters like Stiltman, like Blaster, who I mentioned earlier, who was I think a minor Spider-Man villain, and it gave you characters like the Prowler and Scorpion, which is just What If Spider-Man but bigger.
But that was the danger of the Marvel method of writing, though, because in the bullpen they used to knock out one complete comic a day. That's a ridiculous amount to get out.
That is incredible.
And that's why, with the Marvel method, he'd say to the artists, this is where I want the story to go. They'd draw the pictures and leave the speech bubbles, and then he'd write in the dialogue. So it was a very weird way of doing it. And it wasn't that sustainable, because a lot of people have complained about it. And if you go back to early Marvel comics, reading them now, it's a bit of a chore.
I mean, that's the thing. They weren't all fantastic. Like, I think it's easy to pretend that, all of these things were gems, and he came up with all these characters and everything was great and fantastic. But actually, comic books, I would think, I mean, obviously, there's been good comic books in every decade before and since Stan Lee, but I think a lot of the writing and the quality of the art now is better than it used to be.
100%.
It's all, I mean, it's the sake of evolution, isn't it? Like, the artists get more detailed, they learn more, and everything is built on the work of the people who came before them. So it's almost like inevitable that things get better, as it were. But it just takes the person willing to just go out on a limb and come up with the first idea to create the thing that nobody knew they wanted, that became the thing that everybody needed.
Yeah, and if it wasn't for Stan Lee, then we wouldn't have these characters. And every idea that Stan Lee had, Ditko and Kirby, give it to those guys and help flesh it out. So as much as Stan Lee deserves a considerable amount of the credit, it also wouldn't be where it was if it wasn't for those two either.
That is also true. Like, it's, I mean, how much we want to dwell on this is up for debate, but the fact of Stan Lee's career is, as we say, Stan Lee was extremely good at selling Stan Lee the product as much as Stan Lee the man, and the side effect of that was that people who he worked alongside, who weren't quite as good as that relentless kind of self-promotion and mythologizing, kind of got left by the wayside a little bit. There were people who worked on the books with him, and as you say, the Marvel method that he kind of pioneered involved him just writing a script, giving a very vague outline to the artist and letting them go crazy with it.
Yeah.
And I mean, we see it today, like every other week on Twitter, there's an ongoing debate between artists and writers and people who enjoyed the books and critics and everyone else, talking about how much the creative team is important. Like, does the writer matter more? Is it all on the artist? Like, there's been more of a push in recent years for the colorist and letterer to get more attention, as well as the editor, which I think is a good thing, because comics are inherently collaborative. Sometimes people write and draw and do everything themselves, but sometimes that works out and you get, The Dark Knight Returns, and sometimes that happens and you get The Dark Knight Returns 2 and 3, which we shall not speak of. But yeah, like, comic books are incredibly collaborative just because of the amount of work that goes into them. And like you say, back in the day, they were making a comic book a day, which would be completely unfeasible, I think, at modern standards, at the speed that you have to work, the amount of pages you have to write that goes into a series.
And the detail in the drawings and stuff as well.
It's incredible. But yeah, it's the thing, like, just because Stan Lee was the most famous person or was the best person at standing on top of a hill and shouting about how good he was, doesn't change that actually he didn't do it alone, and sometimes that kind of gets forgotten a little bit, I think.
The fact that he was such a showman, and the fact that he could sell everything. Like, he could sell ice to a penguin. He was just that good at what he did, and that's one of the reasons that all of these creations got as big as they did, I think.
So yeah, so looking at the kind of things that he's involved in, the kind of things he managed to achieve over the length of his career, I mean, it's a little bit ridiculous, really. Again, any kind of career that lasts that long and involves that many things inevitably ends up getting a little bit silly. But do you guys have like a favorite thing that Stan Lee worked on in any capacity, like a favorite character, a favorite book, like the favorite cameos we talked about a minute ago? But is there anything that you think that, not as you could sum up your entire relationship, but a thing that you look at and go, that is the best thing that I think that Stan Lee managed to do?
I'm going to let Ryan go first, because he's not said a word in about 4 hours. I don't know if he's still here.
That's true. Sorry, we've been talking a lot.
It's difficult to say. I think Rick had some really good points about how the characters that he created had other stories about them. They weren't just heroes. And I think the biggest and best thing that I can say is, that is what I personally really like about comics is, I don't just want a story about someone going around and kicking someone's butt or anything like that. It's a case of I want to be able to hear, I want both sides of that story, especially when you've got people like Spider-Man and, that whole relationship between him as Spider-Man and Peter Parker, and the troubles that Peter has in school or in, work or anything like that. And that's such a good thing. And Rick put the nail on the head earlier by saying it's something that you can relate to these characters, and you're not relating to the hero, you're relating to the actual person. and that's probably the best thing that Stan Lee, for me, could have done. There's so many characters that you can relate to now because of their personal connections to you as a reader.
Yeah, I think that's the central tenet of everything that Stan Lee kind of made into comics, and it made into everything else. I mean, even just the personality he cultivated in when he was on stage, or when he was on the screen, or when he was just kind of out in the world being Stan Lee. It was of a person as much as it was larger than life. He was never beyond anything. He was just kind of there to be appreciated and enjoyed. What about you, Rick?
Well, my favourite character, Stan Lee character, is Spider-Man, without a doubt. For the reasons that I mentioned earlier. I am a complete nerd. I have been all my life.
Oh, what a shock. None of us could have guessed that one.
That's it.
And having Peter Parker as a character was really interesting to me as a kid because I could see myself in him. Granted, I wasn't that smart and my girlfriend wasn't a redhead model, but the whole nerdy aspect of it was, here's this meek kid with glasses who's got bad hair and he's too skinny. But as soon as he puts on the mask, he's an absolute hero. And for that reason as well, the X-Men, I have favourite characters, but they're not really Stan Lee creations. But the X-Men as a concept is something that I find brilliant and very important in media, to be honest. I think the X-Men were a very important creation because they were the outcasts. The whole point of them, apart from going on big adventures and stuff, was these are a group of people who are all different, but they preach tolerance to each other. They teach you that just because you're different doesn't mean you're bad. And just because you're different doesn't mean that you're alone. You've got people out there like you. You're always going to find friends and family where you look for it. They're important because they gave people who were struggling with their sexuality something to latch onto, because even though they were mutants and they were fighting politicians and other mutants, you can just look at the real world equivalent and go, well, I don't feel like I belong because of how I'm wired. And you're looking at these characters and finding yourself in them. And I think that's an incredibly important thing for kids to have, because it taught me that, you know, I can be different. I can be strange. You know, I've been suffering with, I've brought it up before, but I've had mental illness issues since I was about 7. You know, depression's been a big thing in my life and I've never felt like I belonged. But reading the X-Men, I could relate to them, because I found out that it was okay to be broken.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Like, I would have said the X-Men if you hadn't, but I felt a very similar way. Like, the X-Men, it's such a brilliant idea that obviously it was Stan Lee who came to it first, but like, if he hadn't, someone would have had to have come to the notion of just someone who is a superhero, not because they have lots of like money and parental issues, or because they happen to be an alien from space, but just because every day they were a normal person until something changed and suddenly either they were always different and that was the thing that made them special, or just one day they woke up and realized they weren't like everyone else.
Yeah.
And I think that was probably the most important thing. Like you say, it's the human part, and nothing is more human than feeling like you don't belong. I think, not to get all deeply philosophical, but especially for kids and teenagers who kind of come to comic books and especially fall in love with them, it's the notion that you're not like everyone else, and not only is it okay, but that thing should be celebrated. And the X-Men, I think, dealt with the most pressing issue of, like, for those of us who don't look like everyone else, or don't think like everyone else, or are different from the way that, you know, quote unquote society determines we should be, it's enough to go, yeah, this is gonna suck. Like, people are gonna hate you because of the color of your skin, whether it is white or brown or blue or green or whatever. If who you choose to be friends with, where you choose to be, what decisions you make, what decisions are made for you sometimes, but those things they don't have to define you. And even if they do, like, that can be your superpower.
Yeah.
You know, I've said before, my favorite, weirdly, because I loved the X-Men 90s cartoon, and which wasn't great, I've looked back at it recently, and it's not fantastic. And my favourite X-Men character was Beast, who one of the original characters who went through quite a lot of changes over the years. He started out, he was just like a big dude with really big feet, and then he turned into kind of a grey...
He just kind of looked like a shaved gorilla, really, didn't he? He was like...
Yeah, and then he turned into a gorilla with fur on. And then into a blue gorilla with fur on. But in the
and
version...
then into a cat.
Yeah, he looked kind of cat-like, and then there's been more things in the comic about him changing again. He looks a bit different now. Like, the model is kind of a bit more cat-like, but he has these kind of bat ears, and it's all very strange. But the thing I loved when I was a kid, when I watched that cartoon, was the fact that Beast was it's ridiculous, really, because all the X-Men, especially the original X-Men, were all, whiter than driven snow, literally in the case of Iceman. But as someone who was a non-white kid in a very white neighborhood growing up, like, I felt a lot like I empathized a lot with Beast, because he was a character, like, I thought he was cool and he had cool powers because he could do like flips and stuff, but he was also intelligent, and he like read books, and he knew he was the smart member of the team as well as being kind of the cool looking one. And I remember being incredibly disappointed as a kid when I found out that Beast was a white guy before he was like a blue monkey person. Because I remember feeling a little bit let down and like, oh, I thought he was like me. And he always was. That's the real truth of it, I know now, is that those characters, all the things that you feel about them are because they are like you. Like, if you feel like you're, an outsider like Wolverine, or if you're, a put upon idiot like Cyclops, those characters get to be the people that you are. And Spider-Man is really good for that as well. Like you said, he's a struggling kid, and we can't all relate to what it feels like to be Spider-Man, but we can all relate to Peter Parker. And I think the X-Men just being willing to be like, here are heroes who are heroes both because and in spite of the way they were born, and the fact that everyone around them sees them as different, I think is incredibly powerful. And Stan Lee's probably his most significant achievement, at least from my perspective. Obviously, he achieved quite a lot. The other thing I would say, given that X-Men was already mentioned, was most relevant to recently was Black Panther.
Yeah.
That Black Panther started off in a weird comic book. I don't know if you've read any of the original stories that Black Panther appeared in, because he turned up as kind of a side sort of villain in the Fantastic Four, and it wasn't always great. Like, the comics in the 1960s being what they were, he used to be like grey because I guess they didn't have any brown left over.
Grey Panther.
Yeah, no, but his costume was kind of blackish grey, and then his actual skin tone underneath was grey for unspeakable reasons. And, it's kind of what it is. But the notion of Black Panther, I suppose, less specifically for the Black Panther character as he existed in the 1960s, which, for all his wonderful progressiveness, there's still a little bit of a kind of a dated element to that character. But what that character means now, I think, is incredibly important. Again, like the notion of a character who not only one of about 4 mainstream black superheroes that I can think of, but the star of one of the highest grossing Marvel movies, which are already the highest grossing overall film franchise in the history of time, I think. And like that character, just that it created space for it, because Lord knows, like, all those superheroes, the first generation of them were, they were, as much as characters like the X-Men exemplified things like struggle and civil rights, there was only so much you could do with them, only so much that Stan Lee, I'm sure, could get away with under the editorial kind of hand of Marvel and whichever company owned it at the time. So the fact that he managed to create a character like Black Panther, who was a little bit of a villain and then became his own thing and now is the thing, like for hundreds of millions of kids all over the world, Black Panther is like the coolest superhero now, in a way that I as a pretty big nerd as a kid had heard of Black Panther, but I couldn't have told you a single character that was in the stories with him. But now he's a character that kids have on their t-shirts and on lunchboxes, and kids probably, I would hope at least, in the playground, argue over who gets to be Black Panther, as opposed to, when you're playing superheroes as a kid and you say that character and everyone's like, who is that? That's not a real character. And you're like, no, it is. I read the comic books. And everyone's like, shut up, Reuben. That might just be me.
I used to have to be Catwoman in the playground because I had a mullet. So, I was already gender swapping characters when I was a kid. I was progressive, you see.
Yeah, of course. There is a lot to unpack in that sentence. I feel like you had to be Catwoman because of your mullet.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like I overshare on this podcast.
These are the things people are going to be tweeting at you later.
Yeah. Oh, now I just want to see someone. So if anyone out there knows Photoshop, can you please Photoshop Rick's face onto any of the Catwomen? Preferably not the Halle Berry one, because that might be a little insensitive, but any of the others go crazy.
But now that you've said that would be hilarious.
That's the one that I want to see now. Forget anything else. Halle Berry one.
Yeah,
please.
Reuben, you've dug your own grave now, mate.
I've done it. I've started it. I've opened the
You've
floodgates.
created a monster.
Oh, that's a disturbing image.
Me dressed in ripped leather. I'm coming for you.
Oh, God. No, now it's disturbing.
I'll lick milk off your belly.
Okay.
Oh, God, the noise as well. I wasn't expecting the noise.
I think with that horrifying bit of Foley, I think it's time for us to end this week. I think we've besmirched the good name of Stanley Lieberman quite enough for one day. So I don't think we have any letters from the comment section for this particular episode, but if you do have any thoughts about Stanley, about the characters he created, the worlds he shared, if you want to overshare with us and talk about your childhood trauma through the medium of comic books, Ryan, where can they find you?
They can find me on Twitter at the Ryan Goodman.
Cool. And Rick, where can people find you?
You can find me on YouTube at youtube.com/strangeplay and on Twitter at strangeplayuk. And I just thought, I'm pretty sure it was those playground days is the reason that I'm not a big DC fan.
Weird that. It's a weird connection to make, but you know.
I feel like I'm discovering so much.
If there's one thing this podcast can give you, it's nightmares from your past.
Well, I was going to say closure, but we'll also go with what you said.
I mean, it's after the whole ripped leather and milk licking comment, I think we're pretty much at nightmares now.
Yeah, I think that's it.
And if you want to come share and, like, in my trauma, send me horrifying fan edits of Rick as Catwoman or tell me about your favourite X-Man, you can find me on Twitter at ReubsCubes. That's ReubsCubes. So until next time, thank you very much for listening. We'll see you again soon. Hopefully all three of us will be there for the next time. We're going to keep this train rolling. Although, again, as we established, I am fired for not having seen more rats. So until next time, enough said.
Go!
You and your ears are quite welcome for the podcasting goodness that you just heard. Why not roll on over to BigRedBarel.com for more podcasts, news, reviews, and videos from the biggest, reddest site on the internet, BigRedBarel.com.